Welcome back to the secret underground lair. So we're at a point now, we have this pedestal on our pedestal table is now smooth, at least to the point where I'm ready to take it off and just start sanding it. Except for these jagged edges that I had put there deliberately during the glue up, just to make the cutting of these wedges a little bit easier. So yeah, a little bit of cleanup now. So here's the theory that I've got. What I need to have is a plate that I can clamp on here. Think of a hinge. So I want to put a hinge on here that will let me attach a saw that can drop down onto this piece. But when it drops down, I need to make sure that this bottom edge of the hinge, that's this edge here, is parallel to that shaft. The angle of that we have mounted our pedestal. So I need to be able to mount this hinge here, but twist it so that it is parallel with that. And then when the saw drops down, it's going to drop down parallel to that shaft, 90 degrees perfectly to this, which means that cut would be straight. So, how do I mount that hinge? And mount it to what? The intention is, I'm going to mount that to a circular saw. That circular saw will twist a little bit, and then on the hinge, it can drop down in to the piece. So it's kind of holding the tip of the saw there on that hinge so that it can drop down. I got a bunch of scraps of material here. I'm going to try and make something. That's today's adventure. Just a little more detail. So I'm going to make a little block that'll sit up here, made up of two pieces. One that sits on this side of the rail and one that sits behind the rail. So these two pieces will sandwich the rail to clamp the block in place. Coming off this block are going to be two bolts coming from behind. And the theory being now that the plate, or the hinge plate, let's call it the hinge plate, the saws are going to be mounted on this lower portion of the hinge plate. One of those, a single hole will go onto that bolt, act as the pivot point, and then we'll have a slot on this side so that we can move the hinge plate up and down and clamp it into place when we have it in the right spot. So I'm working on these two blocks right now on the saw. I'm going to cut them to be 7 inches long. And then we'll work on this hinge plate. Just need a little extra bit of thickness on this piece to give us the width of the inside of the bed rail. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this piece on its own leaves about 1/4 of an inch exposed here on the front. But by putting that 1/4 inch plywood in behind it, I now come out flush with the edge of the bed rail. In fact, just slightly proud, which is where I want to be to give us the best motion for the hinge plate. So I'm going to glue these two guys together, clamp them, then do a little bit of shaping on them just to kind of even up the edges with the benchtop belt sander. So while our clamp block is gluing up, just going to give our tight bond a little chance to settle in on that. We'll work on the hinge plate. All right, we have a hinge mounted. Now we can mount the saw onto this face. And we just need to worry about our top hinge plate. Let me bring over the saw, show you what I have in mind. So on the front of the saw, there's a little slot here that comes through on this side for a guide bar. And you may recall on one of our previous builds where it was making the kerf cuts for bending the top of our tall cabinet, I needed a little guide for the saw, so I made this little arrangement. So this will work actually pretty well. Putting them on here, what I can do is drill a hole through this end of that little guide bar, drill a hole through this end of that little guide bar, and bolt that into our hinge plate, and that will keep the saw exactly where I want it to be. Okay, so I drilled the holes in that little guide bar and into the lower hinge plate. So now I'm just going to tighten these up. There we are. The saw is now mounted on a hinge plate. So now we need to work on the upper hinge plate. We'll do the same kind of thing. And in this upper hinge plate though, we're going to make one slight variation in that we need a slot. Oops, get off camera here. So on this upper hinge plate, which I'll imagine is cut off there, there will be a hole in one side and a slot in the other that will allow us to rotate this. So let me go get some rough measurements for how big I want this upper plate to be. Our saw now attached to the lower hinge plate, and I've attached an upper hinge plate, and a slight design modification. Rather than having the slot on this side, I'm going to have the slot on this side. Gives me a little bit more clearance on the as it sits up against the drum. So the block that we glued up earlier has the glue's now set, so I just kind of sanded all those little bits flush. I did a little round over on this edge here, just on the belt sander, so that it sits inside the bed rail a little nicer. And now I'm just embedding these bolts into our block. And to do that, I'm using my vise. I'll just show you what I'm up to over there. This is a fairly simple operation. I drilled a 10 millimeter hole here with a Forstner bit, and the rest of the way through with a 1/4 inch bit. I'm just taking a 1/4 inch, 1/4 bolt. That's a 7/16 head on it. So that just slips through the hole. Well, okay, it's a snug fit, but that's what I want. Goes in the hole, butts up against there. I'm just using this pipe coupler as a spacer, just so that the bolt has a place to travel, but the head of the bolt is now up against this part of the vise, and clamping it down just drives the head of the bolt into the piece. So that's now a flush in there. This will go up against the bed rail. I have a bolt protruding on this side onto which I can put a locking nut and a clamping knob. These holes are exactly 5 inches apart, so I can now drill the holes in the upper hinge plate, one hole, and then plan the slot on the other side. So let's get started on that part. All right, so on our upper hinge plate, I've drilled the hole. This is going to be our fixed hole, and I drilled the start of what will be our arc slot. So now I need to use the router, fix this in place, and then we can router that part out. Let me get the router set up. So I've set up my router table. I have the 1/4 inch bit coming through here, and now I simply put that are on this end of the router bit where I want that slot. And what I did is I just put a bit in here and I drilled a hole through this router table. Now you may be thinking, but you're ruining your router table. No, this is exactly why I have a router table made out of MDF, is that it's smooth and flat and it's sacrificial. I can make marks like this, and I can drill little holes when I need to make a special jig. So simply putting that pin in there, now I can move this along, spin this around rather, and I can get exactly the arc that I want. Easy peasy. All right, let me make that little cut. Quite clearly you can see I'm using a very dull bit. Should have used another bit. Anyhow, there is our arc cut perfectly in line with that hole. Let's see how this lines up on the block that we just set over there. So that now sitting on our block, that'll pivot exactly how I want it to pivot. That gets us a little bit beyond the angle of our rotisserie, so it'll come back somewhere around here. That angle, by the way, is about 16.23 degrees is what I have calculated. So I have this now clamped on here. That seems to be working okay. Some screws going through the back here. What I did need to do is put in a little spacer, so temporarily I've just put these little spacers in, effectively slightly wider than the width of this bed rail, such that the pressure applied here kind of forces the lower portion of this clamp up against the back. It's much more effective. We have our upper hinge bracket ready to go. So I'm going to 3D print a knob and put a nut and a spacer on there, and of course get the hinge mounted back on here. And then we should be ready to make a cut. I have the saw now mounted onto our little cutoff jig on the bed rail rotisserie. So I'm going to do this cut first. I drew a pencil line around there, just held a pencil and spun it, so that's about where I'm going to cut. And then we're going to do the top, but I have to do that not all the way through on the whole thing because I still have this clamp here kind of holding it all in place, so I have to be careful with that. This side I'm okay. So this side I can cut off all right. So I'll set up the camera. Let's give this a shot. What could possibly go wrong? Okay, first off, I want to find a way to hold that up. So I'm going to break all the rules and pin this up here. Now, this is all in the interests of science and the betterment of mankind. So be nice to me. Okay, so now I can spin the saw, hold the piece in place, and I'm grabbing it up here. And then I can slowly turn it around. That's the theory. Checking to make sure I'm getting all the way through, and I am. In fact, I'm cutting a little bit into the bottom disc there, so we're good. I suppose I should put on my new sharp blade. Let me do that. Be right back. All right, take two with a sharper blade. okay? Perhaps a better battery. Try that again. Okay. Let me show you that cut. So we're cut all the way around here. That should be nice and even all the way across. We're taking the saw in and out. I've made a few marks, so I'm gonna have to sand this out a little bit. And right here, I think where I first started, I was a little off. So I have a little gap here that I'm gonna have to deal with. But for a first attempt, that worked okay. I might put the saw on, just move it up a little bit and do one more cut, just to try and get a more even cut all the way around. And then we'll move up to the front and do this one up here. Okay, you're gonna go for round 2 here. Well, that did somewhat better. I'm going to stick with that. There's still a little bit of cleanup to be done here, but we'll keep that as it is for now. Now let's move up to this end. I have to take off this little block here for the router sled, but I'll get this adjusted and come back in a minute. So I'm going to have to rework the plan a little bit, but I have an idea. The problem that I've got here is, of course, you can see we're far away from the piece that we want to cut. But the back of the guide here, our lower hinge plate is now hitting the pedestal. So what I'm going to do is move this whole apparatus onto the other side and cut from the other way. What it'll mean is just flipping this plate around so that we reverse the angle. So let me put it over there. I'll come back when I'm ready to do that cut from that side. So move the thing around. As you can see, we're now on the other side. But I still have a bit of a problem, and that is I'm still touching the piece here. And the reason I'm touching the piece there is because our blade is going to make contact here when I should be making contact up here. So I need to get the whole hinge mechanism lifted up 2 inches. So I'm going to see what I can do on that in order to make that cut. Great. Made a little adjustment, raising our hinge block up about 1.5 inches, almost 2 inches. And that puts the saw blade just about smack in the middle of the piece. Not quite, but close enough. I have enough clearance that I can make that cut. And we'll give this a shot. Okay, this shot is likely to be a little jiggly because I've got you right on the table itself, and I will be bumping it a little bit. So hopefully you'll see what we're doing here. Okay, that went a little bit sideways on me, but I think I'm going to have to call that good enough for now. And we'll clean it up post-production. So let me pull this off and see how we do. So here's our pedestal now off the rotisserie. And looking at how it sits on the table, I'm actually quite pleased with that result. It's sitting quite flat. There's a little bit of a gap here, but I think I can address that with some sanding. Overall, it seems to be sitting very nicely. On the top, it cut off very well again, and you can see we're nice and flush across the top, parallel with the table. And I'm just going to trim these little bits up here with a flush trim saw. So get that cleaned up. I'll come back when that's ready for sanding. So there is our pedestal. It sits very nicely on a table, on the work table. And so on the floor, the top is nicely squared off, parallel with the floor. So I can now shift my attention to building the top for this coffee table. I went over this briefly with some 80 grit paper. Obviously there's lots of filling to be done. This is very rough wood, so I'll put in some filler before I move on to some finer sanding. But I'll call that a video for today. I'm going to say that the bed rail Router Sled Rotisserie was a success. I will be using this again in the future. I have another project or two actually that may come up as a result of this. A little bit of work to do on the cutoff at the right angle. What I did worked, not completely happy with it, so I'll probably make some adjustments to that. But conceptually, I'm good. In terms of routing and making this round, really happy. So thank you very much for watching. We are approaching the Christmas season, so probably be a little short on videos over the next week or so with family and entertaining and that kind of thing that happens. So to you and yours, all the best for the season. Have a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.